Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories.
We're your hosts, Dr. Caitlin
and Dr. Randall,
two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us.
The show will cover worldwide mythology, and season 1 will focus on ancient Greek stories,
giving listeners everything they need to know to understand the new Netflix series Chaos.
And most likely several things that they don't. Join us as we talk, laugh, and sing this fall for The Mything Link Season 1.
Chaos
Theory. You can link that up. It's appropriately chaotic. This whole situation is appropriately chaotic. Maybe that's it. It's a lesson in chaos. Perfect.
It's a lesson in chaos theory.
Welcome to the Mything Link.
Welcome to the Mything Link.
Mything Link.
Welcome, y'all, to the Mything Link. I'm your host, Dr. Randall Oye.
I'm your other host, Dr. Caitlin Curry.
And today, despite our ridiculous laughter, we are diving into the underworld.
Descending into the underworld.
Ooh, descending. The descent.
The descent.
The descent. And content warning, we will be talking about death and punishment and reward and eternal damnation and those types of things. So today, as we descend into the underworld, the last several episodes have taken place in the underworld, essentially. And today we're going to go over the geography and the topography of the underworld and what the underworld represents in both like a mythological and spiritual context. And we are super excited to have our wonderful friend, Dr. Helen Slater, who is an actress, a singer, a composer extraordinaire, here to lend her perspective on what the underworld means to her. So we'll be playing that interview a little bit later in the episode. I want to start by prefacing this episode with a little bit of a disclaimer. We're going to be using a ton of different sources. I'm, as always, going to link our bibliography in the show notes. But one of the sources that we're going to be using are a collection of tablets that are called the Orphic Gold Tablets. And these are notes that were funerary grave goods. So they were found typically placed, sometimes folded and placed in the hand of the deceased, placed over their mouth, placed on their chest, or in some occasions placed in an urn with cremated remains. And so essentially these gold tablets, they were like notes written by loved ones to their deceased loved ones. And the description and instructions for behavior in the underworld are as personal and varied as people are today, right? So basically what we're doing is we're looking at notes that were buried with ancient Greek people. And I know that when I was in middle school and my uncle died, that was the first like significant death I experienced as a cognizant human. And I wrote him a note and I placed it in his shirt pocket. And that was a really like personal thing to me. And so we don't have any way of knowing what these notes, the power behind these notes, who wrote them, why they wrote them. All we know is that they usually contain instructions on how to act in the underworld to earn some sort of blessed existence. And it gives notes on how to act, what to do, what to expect once you get there. And as always, these sources are conflicting because there's no one right way to approach a belief in what happens after death. So I just want to put that out there. As with most archaeology, we're taking our best guess and trying to understand a whole culture through a handful of material goods. Because you know me, I did the archaeology research over here.
Yeah, you did. I love it. I did not. I did the Odyssey.
Good, because I'm never fucking doing the Odyssey, literally ever. I fucking hate it so hard.
I know you do.
And I wish I was different.
I don't. I don't wish you were different.
Oh, you're so kind. All right. So essentially today we want to provide a little bit of like a geographical or topographical roadmap to the ancient Greek underworld as understood through ancient sources, the Orphic gold tablets and the poetic sources that we have that survive from those times.
So I have the Odyssey, the Iliad, Hesiod's Theogony, and Ovid's Metamorphoses sitting on my desk for this episode in terms of poetic sources.
From all of these sources put together, the idea of the ancient Greek underworld starts with Hermes. And Hermes acts as a pretty regular psychopomp in most of ancient Greek sources. And a psychopomp is basically like a spirit guide who assists somebody on their journey to the underworld. And etymologically speaking, if we break the word psychopomp down, psycho comes from an ancient Greek word that means soul, and pompos means conductor. So it's literally like the conductor, the leader of souls, specifically on a journey to the underworld. So most sources tell us that at the moment of death, Hermes comes and escorts your soul down to the river Acheron, which is the entrance to Hades. And Acheron comes from a Greek word that means pain, and looking at this river as the cause of pain for all mortals. And I think that's such a complex view of things, right? Because oftentimes we view death as being painful, not only for the person who is having to make that transition from the living to the dead and undergoing this rite of pain, this passage of pain, essentially, but it's also painful for the people that they leave behind, the people who they leave behind, where the pain is in leaving. The pain is in the eternal nature of death. And from the ancient Greek perspective, death was eternal. We only have 2 instances of Greek figures who don't belong in the underworld making their way out of the underworld. And that's Orpheus and Heracles. And we've discussed both of them in previous episodes. So similar to our modern day Christian perspective here in the US, death was seen as a permanent condition of life.
Right.
There wasn't this idea of renewal necessarily like we see in chaos.
I think it's important to note that the underworld, according to the Greeks and the Romans, was a distinct and physical realm, either in the earth, which is what we see with the Persephone and Hades mythology, when it talks about the earth cracking open and Hades ascending. That was because there was an interpretation of the underworld being physically below the earth realm. So you have this idea that the realms are stacked, right? So like Olympus was physically in the sky. Poseidon's realm, the earth and the sea, were in the middle, and then the realm of the underworld was physically below. In Hesiod's Theogony, he notes that the underworld was as far below the earth as Olympus is above the edge of the world. So there's again that trifecta distinction of the layers of physical places. There's also the idea that the underworld was at the edge of the earth. So in both cases, it's a liminal place that's not actually accessible to humans.
Right. So if we think about the earth from an ancient Greek context, that the earth has edges and the earth itself is held on the shoulders of Atlas, then it's at the metaphysical ends of the earth where you find this entrance to the underworld. And some tellings and some sources of the underworld specifically name Atlas in having to pass beyond his realm to access the entrance to the underworld.
That said, the entrance to the land of the dead in this case was seen as beyond the stream of the ocean, or river Oceanus. Depicted on Achilles' shield is the river Oceanus. It goes around the rim of the outside, and that's because there was the understanding of this particular river, the one that was like the preface to leading to the underworld, as encircling the world as they understood it. So it was the great world encircling river is what it was considered to be. So beyond that was the shore where the forest of Persephone was understood to be. Then you start to see the tributaries to the river Styx. Now, the river Styx is typically the river that most of us, just off the cuff know to be associated with the Greek underworld. It is derived from the words to hate or to abhor in Greek, but is also the river of unbreakable oath by which the gods swear. So we've talked about this in a previous episode where Zeus swears by the river Styx to grant a boon because you can't break an oath that you've sworn on the river Styx. So then you have the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, that people who had already entered the underworld were expected to drink of in order to forget their mortal life. You also have the river Phlegethon or Pyriphlegethon, the fire-flaming river, Cocytus, the river of lamentation. Both of these flow into the Acheron tributary, the river of woe or pain, which is thought to lead to the underworld because this is an actual river in Greece, and it flowed through dark gorges, and at certain points the river Acheron goes underground. So that's where this understanding of the river Acheron being a tributary that leads to the entrance of the underworld comes from.
Yes, and in Chaos, we see the entrance to the underworld portrayed as the cave, as this bar that Orpheus has to go on a journey like before he even gets to the river. And I kind of love this because it implies that to get to the banks of the river is like outside the realm of human society and structure and everything, and shows that like you can't just access it and journey to the underworld in an easy way at all. So let me give like a very basic breakdown here. In the ancient Greek tradition, this is what happens after you die. Hermes shows up, acts as a psychopomp to escort you to the river Acheron. Once you're at the river Acheron, that is where the river Styx meets the river Acheron. That's where you meet Charon. And Charon is an old, impatient man who ferries souls from the land of the living into the depths of the underworld. And so it takes Hermes to get you down the river to where the river Styx actually is. And then once you're there, you have to pay Charon your fare. In Frogs, Heracles says it's 2 obols. So an obol was like a very small unit of currency in ancient Greece. I'd say kind of similar to like a penny or a nickel or something today. It was pretty small change, and you needed 2 of them. And so if a person was buried without a coin to pay their passage across the river Styx, they must wander the banks of the river for about 100 years before being allowed to enter the underworld properly. So basically, they're stuck on the earthbound side in that purgatory between the land of the living and the dead, on the banks of where those rivers meet. And we're told that these rivers are very loud roaring because it's not just the river Acheron and the river Styx, but it's also Cocytus and Pyriphlegethon.
Pyriphlegethon.
Fuck me.
Pyriphlegethon.
Pyriphlegethon. And there's a big rock where all of these rivers meet together, and the waters
Also,
are
it's
mixing.
Cocytus.
Well, fuck me. I can't say any of these words.
Pyriphlegethon. Cocytus. Acheron. Lethe.
But in Chaos, the way that they did that is that the folks who didn't have their coins, they were still allowed to cross the river Styx into the underworld, but then they were put to work once they got there. And I don't remember how long they said they had to work for, but there's like a chunk of years that you had to work off, and then you could earn your passage through the frame. On Chaos, Charon is portrayed by Ramon Tikaram, an actor from Singapore. And he brought a very dynamic interpretation to the character. And Charon is typically depicted in Greek mythology as this like older kind of crotchety man, which like think about what his job is. I think that's enough to make anybody crotchety, ferrying the newly dead souls to their forever resting place in the underground. And this is before, presumably before the souls had drank from the river Lethe. And so they still know who they are. They have all the questions and they're
Are annoying.
annoying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like, think about those of us who have worked in customer service jobs with the general public, right? People ask the same questions over and over and over again.
Mhm.
And at a certain point, it's like, yo, didn't you read the manual before you got here? Like in Beetlejuice,
Mhm.
right? Did you read your manual?
Mm.
So it can make logical sense to us as mortals that Karen would be this Karen.
I see
Yeah.
what you did there.
Thank you so much.
You're
This
welcome.
Karen, Charon, could become a Karen.
Karen.
Karen. Randall can spell. Randall's an English
Randall.
professor. So he's typically depicted as somebody who is strong and wise because he has to essentially like, he's like river rafting. Like the rivers of the underworld are choppy and stormy and perhaps unforgiving. And so Karen is a very, very important figure in this, right?
And he's an important figure in chaos for sure.
Yeah,
The plot
absolutely.
couldn't move forward without him.
Ooh, literally, just like our souls can't move forward without him. And so, mythologically speaking, we don't really have a record of Karen having any interaction with Prometheus that I found. The Karen of mythology is quite different from the Karen of chaos, and we love those differences. And just know that there's no textual evidence that points to any sort of relationship between Karen and Prometheus. As far as we know, they didn't really know each other. So once you pay your 2 obols to Karen, you come to Cerberus, and Cerberus is guarding the gates to the underworld. And he's described as like really nice and friendly as long as you don't try to attempt to escape. Otherwise, one of his 50 heads will devour your soul. And from there, you meet the judges of the dead. The judges of the dead are who's going to determine where you are sent in the underworld. So the Greek underworld housed the souls of everyone. It wasn't the equivalent of hell as it's often seen in Christianity. So depending on what the judges saw in you, they can send you to one of 3 areas of the underworld. The first is the realm of eternal suffering, which is known as Tartarus.
Tartarus was a place of torment. In our last episode, we talked about the Furies physically tormenting souls in the underworld. So that's where Sisyphus was, pushing the rock repeatedly up the hill for only it to roll back down. Tartarus was the lowest point where the worst of the worst went.
The second is the Islands of the Blessed, which are known as the Elysian Fields. Or the third are the Fields of Asphodel. And pretty much every human should expect to end up in Asphodel. Asphodel is featured heavily in Chaos, both the realm and in Orpheus's song. And what's fun is that in the Asphodel Fields, ghosts are as plentiful as the flowers. And one article I read, Hamilton, I'll link, presumably strange, pallid, ghostly flowers. I like this idea. And in Chaos, we see this reflected as the underworld being in black and white, just the grayness. It's forsaken of sunlight. It's lacking in joy. It's kind of like a semi-existence for common people. Hopefully you're not allergic to any of the flowers there.
I probably am allergic to all of them. So it would probably be more like Tartarus for
Tartarus
me. Literal eternal suffering.
what I liked about Chaos is they didn't really go into the Elysian Fields or Tartarus. They really focused in on Asphodel and the souls of the regular mundane folks. And so it kind of took away that element of divine punishment or retribution and just turned it into the general thing that happens to souls after we die.
Right.
And for most of us, that's the case. And I think it's really interesting from now that you've seen The Good Place. In The Good Place, the TV show, there's the medium place.
Yeah.
And spoiler alert, in the medium place, there's only one person who lives there. So I think that's a fun comparison to Christianity and what we believe happens to souls after death, right? The ancient Greeks believe like most regular people live regular lives and go to a regular gray place after they die, where it's not punishment, it's not reward. You just kind of like fade into the gray background.
Right. Which is why it's the fields of Asphodel, right? Like they're a ghostly gray ashen color, you know, and fields of Asphodel are often associated with just being gray. And the word ash came up repeatedly in my research, which is something that I loved about what Chaos did, was portray the underworld in black and white. Like Asphodel flowers are gray tone.
I think the Asphodel flowers are pretty. I mean, they're white.
I think they are too. I like Asphodel flowers.
Okay, so as we know, Cerberus guards the gates of the underworld. Let's start with the etymology, because I know we've talked about it in previous episodes, but we might have some new listeners
We
today.
have. So the etymology of the word Cerberus or Kerberos in Greek is really confusing and unclear. Nobody can actually agree on what it is, because over history it's been translated in a bunch of different ways. It's thought of being related to the Greek word karbaros, or heavy-headed, or growl. My personal favorite is to believe that it roughly translates as the spotted one, or speckled, or spot. And that's not because I don't know the history of the complicated etymology of this word. It's because there's speculation that the word for Cerberus is related to the Sanskrit epithet of one of Yama's dogs. And people actually just did name their dogs random things like we do. So Cerberus was the guardian of the entrance of the underworld with his 3 heads, and certain places in some of these books talk about him being like friendly and like his tail wagging and his ears perking, unless you try to fuck with him, right? So his whole job was to ensure that the dead did not leave the underworld, and also so that the living did not enter, right? Like he had a very specific and important task of assisting in the maintenance of the natural order. So rather than disrupting the natural order like we see a lot of mythological beasts doing throughout mythology, his purpose in blocking people from entering and exiting the underworld was to ensure that that distinction between life and death was maintained. And so there's a reason why, and I think I talked a little bit about this before, the 12th labor of Hercules was for him to get Cerberus out of the underworld. Heracles, he asks Hades, and Hades says, sure, but you can't use weapons and you can't hurt him. So there's speculation about why this was. Obviously, probably because Hades didn't want some random ass fuckboy killing his dog, but also because if Heracles had actually killed or hurt Cerberus, he would have disrupted the life and death cycle. And in doing that, in killing or maiming the guardian to the gate of the underworld, Heracles would have allowed others to do the same. So that boundary between life and death would have become blurred. And I think, well, I know you're laughing at me.
I'm not laughing at you. I'm trying not to interrupt, but like this is the first time we've identified Heracles as a fuckboy, and like he absolutely is a fuckboy.
He's such a fuckboy.
Like,
I know. Why have
for
we not
all
said this
intents and
before?
purposes? Because we haven't done an episode on Heracles, because specifically because he is a fuckboy. No, just kidding. Because he's not featured in Chaos, and he's not our area of interest.
No, he's not.
But
I'm
he's
not
like portrayed as a fuckboy
in
in the Disney version too. Absolutely. Right? He's a fuckboy.
He's a fuckboy. He's such a fuckboy. I can't even.
I know. That's why I was laughing. I'm like, we can't go down this path, but like,
we
I can't like. I would like to ask you a question about Cerberus that I'm sure a lot of our
Please.
listeners have this question.
I would love to know.
I have seen Cerberus frequently depicted as having 3 heads, but our sources
Yes.
say that he has like 50 heads, or insert a large number of heads here. What's that about?
So Cerberus is typically depicted in Greco-Roman art as having 2 or 3 heads, most commonly 3 heads, sometimes 1 head. Hesiod talks about Cerberus having 50 heads, and that's interesting because Cerberus, he had many siblings. One of his brothers was a hydra, and his mom was an echidna. So there's a relationship with snakes there. The first compendium of Greco-Roman myth that we have from the random pseudo-source Apollodorus, he synthesized this into Cerberus has 3 heads and then snakes lining his back. All this to say, I think there's always like translation issues, and people will try and synthesize different myths into one. Hesiod's Theogony. The whole point of him writing the Theogony was to try and organize the chaotic Greek mythology. So Greek and Roman mythology don't really have a chronological order. The whole reason that Hesiod wrote the Theogony was try and give order to these, what he perceived as chaotic myths. Or like Apollodorus was trying to synthesize into one collection all this different mythology. And like Randall and I have talked about before, oral traditions are messy and different, and campfire stories and ancient games of telephone. And so writing them down is just another version of a campfire story. But we only have those written sources, right? So we don't actually know which one of these was like the truest or the realest. But for the most part, people have historically portrayed and understood Cerberus to have 3 heads, and we've kind of stuck with that just because Greek myth happened in threes a lot. You have the triple-headed goddess in Hecate, you have the 3 Furies, you have the 3 Fates. To me, it makes sense that there would be 3 heads, honestly. There is one myth of Cerberus that I think is really fun. Ovid tells the story of when Heracles brings Cerberus up to the surface from the underworld. He dragged Cerberus in chains. The hound was furious. His eyes could not support the light, the glare of naked day, and tugging loose, his 3 heads barked as one, and barking sprayed the green fields with white foam. So from that white foam springs what we today would call wolfsbane, a poisonous plant that Medea eventually tries to poison Theseus with, which is fair. I would also try to poison Theseus with it. So Cerberus's saliva is considered to be poisonous, and that's the origin story of how wolfsbane as a poisonous plant came to be, which I think is really fun. Kind of
That is
witchy.
really fun. In a couple of the so-called Orphic gold tablets that were found, specifically in 2 of these tablets, and about 40 of these tablets have been found dating from around the 5th century BCE to the 3rd century CE. So we have a huge span of hundreds of years that these gold tablets were created during. And in a couple of them, the advice to the dead is to choose to drink of the memory instead of forgetting from the river Lethe, because river Lethe is said to have been made up of the memories of the souls who have died. So it's kind of unclear, and these are some of the only sources that we have that say anything about a river of memory that's not one of the 5 rivers that Caitlin had named. But the implication here could be that there's some way that you could choose to drink of this memory to set your soul apart once you get to the judgment. And I see definite parallels to Christianity. Absolutely. If we're going to be eating from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or drinking from the river, that enables us to set ourselves apart with the memory. So we see that in the Hipponian and Petelia tablets. That was just a really interesting piece of these gold tablets that I wanted to make sure to bring up. What I think is cool about these Orphic gold tablets, and that's what they're frequently referred to, but it's been disproven that they're not associated necessarily with the cult of Orpheus in any way. or necessarily with the Orphic tradition, but they just have to do with what happens after death. And some of these were written on such thin leaves of gold on top of a soft surface like leather. And so you can read the inscription from both the top and the bottom as they were like very carefully written out. And they're super, super tiny. So they're basically like little gold leaves, little scraps of paper. They're not like the Sumerian tablets that we think of when we think of the word tablet. They're very fine and delicate. And I just feel like there's such beauty in someone taking the time to pen a leaf of gold to the deceased with their final thoughts and opinions and recommendations. And this is what you're going to see in the underworld. This is what you should do. I care about your soul and your soul's journey as it passes beyond my realm of understanding. And this is my final wish, that you find some luck and success. And I mean, it's like Little Red's parents sending her out to meet her grandmother, right? Here's your food. Here's your coin. Here's a note. Good luck. Godspeed. Oh, I don't know why this feels like it makes me want to cry. I'm feeling the tears welling up in me. It's such a beautiful, sacred piece of mundane, everyday life that has survived thousands of years that we get to bear witness to. And that's what's so special about archaeology to me, is being able to see these little pieces of material culture left over by regular folks just like you and me, and think about how that moment was for them.
I love that. That's so beautiful. And there's something really tender and sweet and precious about, you know, a tiny note that accepts that death has to happen for all of us, wishing you well on your way.
I would also like to talk a little bit about the Eleusinian mysteries. I know we kind of avoid
You are welcome to discuss
talking about them because they're complicated.
They're so complicated.
But just a brief side note, the Eleusinian mysteries, from our understanding, there's no record of what actually happened during these mysterious rites. So there's tons of conjecture, but some sources speculate that the Eleusinian mysteries prepared people to connect with Persephone in order to specifically have a more blessed afterlife. So we could reasonably assume that folks who underwent this process for that specific reason believed that Persephone was the judge of the dead. So for these Eleusinian mysteries, there is some suggestion that there was a belief that Persephone bridged the gap between the living and the dead as a goddess who could, if only seasonally, traverse between the realms of the living and the dead. She was seen as being able to bridge the gap between life and death. And for folks who had undergone the Eleusinian mysteries, perhaps this provided an easier transition or helped them accept the fate of their death a little easier. And there's also some sources that suggest that initiates were afforded a special place in the afterlife, whether that was actually like the Elysian fields where the heroes go, or if it was just a special place near Persephone, or whatever it was. We don't have records of what it could have been, but I like to speculate, I guess, which is why I'm an academic, because that's what academia is. Speculation.
Lots of speculation. One of the most tangible places of the underworld that we have in written form is in Homer's Odyssey, where basically the story of Odysseus goes that after the Trojan Wars, he takes 10 years to get home. It's a whole, like, you know, the Israelites were lost in the wilderness for 40 years on a journey that should have taken them like a week to walk. It's very similar here. Odysseus should not have been lost for 10 years and getting home from like Troy to Ithaca. It is not a 10-year boat ride between those two islands. But what we see in this story is Odysseus is lost for one hell of a long time trying to get back home. And that's like the whole premise of this story. And honestly, there's a lot of beautiful psychology in this story too. So Odysseus washes up on the island of the witch Circe, and she tells him that in order to get the best information on how to get back home, he has to go to the underworld and speak with an old prophet named Tiresias. And so she gives Odysseus directions on how to find the underworld, which are some very interesting directions. She tells Odysseus that once you've crossed the stream of the ocean, again the river Oceanus, you will reach the shore, where willows let fall their dying fruit and towering poplars grow in the forests of Persephone. Tie up your ship in the deep eddying ocean and go into the spacious home of Hades. The Pyriphlegethon and the Cocytus, a tributary of the Styx, both run into Akron. The flowing water resounds beside the rock. Brave man, go there. Odysseus does this. He sails his ship to the end of the earth, and we see him basically dig a hole that he fills with ram's blood as an offering, and this draws up the shades. So the spirits come up and gather around. Teenagers, girls and boys, the old who suffered for many years, and fresh young brides whom labor destroyed in youth, and many men cut down in battle by bronze spears, still dressed in armor, stained with their blood. From every side they crowded around the pit with eerie cries. Here we have this imagery that Randall and I have talked about a lot, that the average person is the one who roams the fields of Asphodel in their death. So these are going to be the people who, earthly labors abandoned. They're numb people who live here, the shades of poor, exhausted mortals, Homer says in another place. So they almost exist in their shapes in this weird half existence. So Odysseus goes on, which is interesting because clearly he's going to find a specific person, and we've already been told that people drink of the river to lose their memory. And yet everybody that Odysseus encounters in this journey remembers who they are, remembers their relationship to Odysseus, remembers what exactly happened to them, and gives him advice based on that. So, like Randall's saying, these letters are advice given to those going forth on their journey. This is almost a backwards parallel to that, where the already dead are giving Odysseus advice on how to live, which is a really interesting flip-flop of this idea. And he gets to talk with his mom while he's down in the underworld, and I think it was a really sad and beautiful depiction of just exactly what we've been talking about, the body not being there, but the shape of the soul and the soul remaining. She says to Odysseus, "My child, how did you come here through the darkness while you were still alive? This place is hard for living men to see." And it goes on to say that though she was dead and he didn't know how, 3 times he tries, longing to touch her, but 3 times her ghost flew from my arms like shadows or like dreams. Sharp pain pierced me deeper as I cried, "No, mother, why do you not stay for me and let me hold you?" So we see here her response is, "Our muscles cease to hold the flesh and skeleton together. As soon as life departs from our white bones, the force of blazing fire destroys the corpse. The spirit flies away and soon is gone, just like a dream. Now hurry to the light, remember all these things so you may tell your wife when the time comes." He goes on to meet with all these rape victims of Zeus and all these people who died in the Trojan War. Then doesn't say like if he's walking through the fields of Asphodel, but he sees Achilles wander through the fields of Asphodel back to the fields of Elysium. And I just think it's a really interesting example of the geography of the underworld, right? So he's going through this journey. He has to journey to get there, and he's able to access the underworld kind of as a living being. So he's able to access the underworld without actually going down into it. So this is what we would call
Interesting.
an actual Nikia, because he's journeying to, descending to the underworld without actually having a physical encounter with the underworld. So he digs a hole and that draws up this swarm of shades. And that means that he doesn't actually have to descend into the underworld, which he would in what we would call a catabasis journey, which is when
Why
you
go to the underworld when you could bring the underworld to you?
which is really confusing because he's talking about all the people that he's seeing, and it's like, it's unclear. In my opinion, it's pretty unclear. But he brings the underworld to himself, and I think I love the idea that he's communing with the underworld and integrating that into his lived experience, right? The whole journey of the Odyssey is Odysseus learning to integrate himself into himself. So throughout the Odyssey, you see him repeatedly telling his story over and over and over again to all these different people. And that speaks to the power of mythology and story as a psychological form of healing. It is a way of processing, it is a form of therapy. And in telling these stories to all these different people, Odysseus is realizing things about himself and healing parts of himself and integrating new knowledge that he's learned about himself on this horrible journey that he's on to get back home. Oh, I'm gonna cry. To get back home. And he's encountering all these dark things. And instead of being like, I refuse all this knowledge, he actually like takes it and integrates it into himself. He takes the knowledge that's offered to him from those in the underworld and uses it as part of his healing and his journey home. Obviously, Odysseus is an asshole and is an incredibly problematic character in terms of number of other reasons, in terms of like portrayals of masculinity, for example. And he gets home and he like tricks his wife and basically slaughters everybody who's been inside of his house. Which is where we see Hermes taking their souls to the underworld later.
And that scene reminds me of the ball boy of Zeus's ball boys,
right?
In
Yes.
Chaos. Like
that's a good.
Immediately when I saw those ball boys and like the way they're hanging around and how quickly that they're persecuted. That might not be the right word.
Smote.
Yeah, how quick Zeus is to strike them down. It like immediately brought just the imagery of Odysseus striking down all the suitors.
I'm already on this rampage, so I'm going to keep going, and I'm just going to cut it out if it doesn't make sense. So throughout the Odyssey, again, we see Odysseus telling and retelling his own story over and over and over again. The parallel is that his wife is doing the exact same thing, but she's doing it very differently. So Penelope, who is at home the entire time Odysseus is gone, and all these suitors are trying to marry her, and they've been, living in her house and eating her food and being threatened by her son the whole time Odysseus is gone. And in order to protect herself, in order to continue to wait for the man that she really loved and who she firmly believes is still alive, she keeps weaving and unweaving and reweaving this piece of tapestry that she's making on a loom. And I think it's a really beautiful parallel to, again, the beauty of story, but this is what we all do with ourselves. And this is the exact analogy that I use to describe, my own deconstruction journey is like, I started to pull on the thread of the Protestant understanding of hell, and I didn't realize that it would undo the whole fucking wall hanging, right? And then all of a sudden, I was left standing there with all of this yarn that I was like, I don't know how to weave. I don't know what to do with this. And so I had to teach myself to reweave a new blanket, a new wall hanging, a new piece of art that I would be fucking proud of and in fucking control of. And, that required a lot of new learning and weaving and unweaving and telling my story and untelling my story and retracting my story and presenting new information and integrating new information and going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And in a lot of ways, Odysseus's whole story and Penelope's whole story are underworld stories, right? They're both hanging in this liminal place where they are waiting to get back home. And I don't like to see it as a control-less waiting. They are in control autonomously of their own destinies to a certain extent, right? At least Penelope is. She is taking control of the situation because she knows what she wants and she knows what she doesn't want, and she is doing what she can with what she has to stay in this liminal place and learn all she can before there is some sort of conclusion to this era of life. And I really strongly identify with the idea of, you don't have to be dead to have an underworld journey, that it can just be any kind of journey, any kind of numinous, liminal, in between mystical experience that you're having where you're just like floating between seasons and worlds and pieces of yourself and understandings of yourself and versions of yourself, right? Like, you don't necessarily have to take a full fucking Nakia or Catabasis journey or Hero's journey, to have this really beautiful experience with yourself where you integrate all these different aspects, even contradictory aspects of who you are, right? Like that's what we get with Persephone, is her integrating all these different versions of herself and all these different woven and unwoven and rewoven versions of herself. That's what we see with Odysseus, all these told and retracted and retold versions of himself, and all of these leading up to finding home, like getting home. And not that there's some sort of finality to it, because I don't really think that there is. And I think you can go through multiple journeys of underworld descent and all those kinds of things. But I really do, I love the correlation in the Odyssey between storytelling, healing, and the integration of the underworld into the lived experience, and how that equates to the, the integration of your shadow into yourself, and the integration of your darkness into your lightness. And I love the idea that the binary is fucking nonsense, but all these things can be true and exist at the same time, right? Like that is the beauty of the underworld to me personally. And that's why I really don't resonate with the Christian idea of hell, is because it's all so distinct, right? Like there is that distinction in Greek mythology. It is its own actual physical place, but all these realms are working in tandem to create this cycle that holds the balance and equilibrium of the universe. And even in their distinctness, there is still an integration and a cycle and an almost like wheel of how these things work and are in balance. And there's active participants in holding to that necessary balance, versus in Christianity, where these things are all distinct and separate from each other, and kind of just places that you go without any kind of context of the earth and hell and heaven are so separate. It's stressful and damning and painful, and you don't really get that sense, in my opinion, from the way that we're told that these things were understood through Greek mythological stories, or at least as they're presented in Greek stories and the Homeric epics. Sorry, that was really long.
Everybody, we are so excited to welcome Dr. Helen Slater to the Mything Link today. And Helen is an incredible human triple plus threat, I would say, at least.
Helen!
There I am.
Hi! Hello, Dr. Slater.
Hello, doctors. Both doctors.
You look beautiful.
Oh, my goodness. Well, first, I'm so happy to be here because any chance to talk about myth and these deep ideas, I'm so happy about. But I mean, I'm known as an actor and for being in films and television. And then I'm also a composer and have written 6 albums, 2 of which are based on myth and fairy tale. One is the myths of ancient Greece, and the other is based on the Ugly Duckling. And
the Selkie.
And the Selkie, I'm sorry, 3, which is the last one. And I would say each of these parts of my career have been deeply soulful in their own ways, but going to Pacifica was right up there as being a composer and being an actor. And that thing of just, I had an extraordinary cohort, and it was incredibly lumpy while we were at Pacifica Graduate Institute because of lockdown and because of we were right in the middle of Black Lives Matter and political, unbelievable upheaval. And we had, Caitlin was like frontline, including many others that were the tuning forks of how do you marry this thing called being a mythologist with the cultural experience we were having. But in terms of just my background, it's fun to kind of look at it like these 3 avenues that have been so fulfilling in their own way.
Do you remember what got you interested into mythology?
I think it started when I went to Performing Arts High School in Manhattan, the Fame School, and I just by happen chance was picked to write the music. One of the teacher there wanted to do new musicals for the bus and truck, these shows that would tour. And he wanted to do it, the first one based on Hans Christian Andersen's The Emperor's Nightingale or The Nightingale. And that kind of started my way in how myth or fairy tale really can be a template or a narrative or a way to, almost like breadcrumbs coming out of the forest, to help us navigate these rites of passage in our life. And Hans Christian Andersen's The Nightingale was really about the soul versus material values. It's just such a beautiful story about a plain nightingale and an emperor that falls in love with the plain nightingale and realizes the depth that he has been completely cut off from, but cages her instead of allowing her to come and go. And anyway, that became something that just spoke to me, and probably everything I've written, or certainly my dissertation, kind of looked at this, that big idea of soul and psyche and ego, and how they're in concert with each other, whether through a Buddhist lens or a Jungian lens or just a mythopoesis lens, or what Caitlin taught me, like probably Caitlin and Mel more than anybody, and Christina, was really looking at the white colonial way that myth had been, like patriarchy, Northern European lens. It was just so helpful for me, who's 25 years older, 30 years older, getting that rich anti-Joseph Campbell, anti-white view of myth and opening my mind up to that. I think we all had to do that because we were in school during the particular time that we were in. And it's just good to get your brain opened, which is always what I want to say to the other side. Like, what's the big deal, man? Just hear what the other side has to say, even if it's your truth or not. Like, it's just stay open. So
That's really
okay.
beautiful.
Heck yeah. I love that.
Well, we're glad you're here. It's also really good to see your face.
Yeah.
I know, and I'm so glad I've been unofficially adopted into y'all's cohort. You're a lot of fun. Glad to be
We're
here.
awesome.
Welcome.
know.
You are our sister.
Okay, so Helen, what kind of like magic does the underworld hold for you? Like, what is it about the underworld that catches your interest?
Oh, that's such a good question. You know, two of the myths which Caitlin knows, and Randall, I think you do too, that are so dear to me, which are the Selkie and Demeter and Persephone. And in both those stories, we have these gorgeous examples of the underworld. With Selkie, it's that her pelt and going back to the sea to actually retrieve the authentic self. And similarly with Persephone, and even Orpheus and Eurydice going down. This idea that the underworld is opposite of ego consciousness, is more of this, for lack of a better word, that there's mystery there. It might be irrational or illegible or liminal, but we really must, all of us in some way, learn to or long to be in a relationship with that. And I think probably originally that's what the gods and goddesses were getting projected onto the gods and goddesses, was that underworld unconscious thing. And we sort of have lost our connection to that, and we're figuring out ways, either through psychology or even if you're back into some kind of wisdom tradition, figuring out some way that kind of bypasses egoic way of experiencing things and having more of a abiding with what the underworld or the unconscious, what those gifts might be, even if the ego might want to like slam it into rational thought. The underworld, or the idea of the underworld, keeps asking you to kind of live with the image or live with the feeling. Or Caitlin and I were talking about illness, which I'm super interested because I seem to, well, right now I'm under the weather, but it really puts me immediately right into that more receptive underworld feeling state where I think there's some boons to be had. Boy, that's a long ass answer. Good luck.
No, it's great. Yeah, no. What I think is interesting is you're talking about the underworld as being like a confrontational feeling state. And in the ancient Greek underworld, there's this idea that you need to forget in order to survive. And so we have this like kind of tension of opposites, where as a living being, we can see like the concept of the underworld in a more abstract sense as this confrontation with our shadow self, which we talked about in our Persephone episode, like the
Mm,
underworld as a manifestation of the collective unconscious or an
mhm.
individual unconscious, right? Like this separation from the ego. But then the only way to reasonably survive in the underworld once you're there as a resident is to drink from the waters of the river Lethe in order to detach yourself from the human being you used to be and kind of conform to the grayness of the underworld.
It's interesting, though. I was thinking about this today because it's the river of forgetfulness that you're expected to drink of once you've been judged and you're being sent on your way to where you're spending eternity. You're supposed to drink from this river of forgetfulness. But in every myth we have of an interaction with somebody in the underworld, they remember, right? You have the prophet Tiresias, who Odysseus goes to talk to get information about how to get home. Orpheus and Eurydice, Eurydice remembers who she was. So we've been told. It's almost like it gives me the vibes of like in the Old Testament when God says, if you look upon me, you're going to die. And then all the people who look upon God don't die. It
Mm.
like gives me that.
And guys, I want to just get clear, River Lethe in which myth? Because I'm familiar with the river Styx, that Psyche crosses over that, and even with Persephone, it's Styx, but I have heard of the river of forgetfulness. And
It's
can
in
you clarify, Caitlin, where?
It's a tributary of the river Styx.
Ah, okay. And you're saying anyone that goes down, that the law is they're going to drink from that. So that's new information for me. That's super interesting. Yes.
Yeah, there
I
are
love that.
several rivers surrounding the underworld, and the myth tells us that it's the river Acheron that's the entrance to Hades, that you basically like pass through
Yes.
into the underworld, and then you meet up with these other tributaries.
I see.
And that's where
see.
you catch Charon and the
Mhm.
river Styx. I hate saying his name is Charon. It sounds so
Karen.
Karen.
I
Like
know.
Karen.
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 The ferryman, you mean? The ferryman?
Yes. Charon.
Well, it's interesting to think psychologically about what does need to be forgotten. Like if you're in the unconscious, if we're in the world of the unconscious, there is a blind spot. You can't bring all of your tools down into the underworld. There's no way you can bring complete understanding. That's kind of the rules of it. So poetically, to me, it makes sense that something has to be forgotten, which maybe is the egoic self, which is that identity, which is the persona, in order to get the boon or the treasure that's in there.
Yeah, it's like Inanna, right? She needed to be stripped down before
yes,
she was
great,
able
great thing.
to enter into.
But Randall, you
that start
used
of the journey.
language that was super interesting to me, that I'm just curious why you used the word confrontation, that in the underworld there's confrontation. And I want to understand your understanding of that, because that's new language to me. So why the word confrontation?
Gosh, that's a good question. So when I think of meeting my unconscious or my shadow self, I think of it as needing to confront parts of myself and pieces of my
see.
psyche that I've
Gotcha.
previously been ignoring, which is why they're existing in my shadow. And so that feels like, I know, and confront is kind of like an abrasive word for sure. And I yeah, probably my complex history of childhood trauma and my thought that everything in my shadow is scary and it's going to require like a massive confrontation for sure. But I also think of the underworld from a Gothic literary sense.
Oh, that's
where
cool. That's super
it's-
cool.
Yeah, like Alice in Wonderland, like Stranger Things, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That's my favorite paper I've ever written, was comparing Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Alice in Wonderland and realizing they're telling the exact same story.
Oh my gosh.
We've got a young blonde protagonist who descends into the underworld where she's uncomfortable. The temperature isn't right. Her clothing isn't right. Everything is wonky and upside down. One sits at a tea party that is supposed to be the bastion of English civilization, and nothing is as expected. And in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, she sits down at a family dinner table, but
Oh, wow.
like everybody else is dead besides her and the Chainsaw Massacre. Leatherface, that's his name.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I've written this. 10
But
plus
that
years.
is so insightful and interesting, like to not only be considering your own psyche, but just how it's in the culture,
Mhm.
how the shadow or how the unconscious is held in works of art, or how that it can be more confrontational at times.
And it's also, to me, like in this
Mm.
literary sense, to me, this is not my original idea, but part of my understanding is that these underworld journeys, for those of us who are able to reemerge from the underworld and rejoin our society and bring back the boon, oftentimes like this comes at a great loss to ourselves, right? And these journeys are those that they say you can never come home again, but you do come home. Hasn't changed, you have.
Right.
And that's what these underworld journeys really provide. And oftentimes I think they're metaphors for going through puberty or big life changes, right? You enter a child and you come out an adult on the other side.
That's
and it's
another
not about
version.
the biological puberty, but it's about like the mental and the emotional change and shifts that happen that completely change who you are as a person. And that feels really confrontational as well. Oftentimes we're the unwilling heroes, involuntary heroes, the ones that are dragged kicking and screaming through this transformative process, and we don't realize how important and necessary it is until we're out on the other side and have that knowledge through walking through our version
You
of the
know, I
underworld.
don't know if this speaks to what you're saying, but so I'm going to be 61 in December, in 2 weeks, and I can't believe, with all the heavy lifting and huffing and puffing and therapy and contemplative practice and sitting on a meditation cushion and walking in the Ryman Canyon, I can still get my ass kicked by whatever the thing is that I'm getting my ass kicked by. And what I want to offer is, it still feels, it has qualities that are the same as in my 20s and 30s and 40s, where you just feel like, I cannot fucking believe this is, it can't be this painful. Like, come on, what have I done to? But I will say this, and I don't know what both of your feelings are about this, but there is a resting back or dropping down, I'm going to say even past the underworld, so that you're holding both. Like, you're no longer, what I feel is, it can happen where you feel like, I've been sucked back down, Alice in Wonderland, Chainsaw Massacre. But then there are these echoes or glimpses or hints that there's something else it's not personal. It happens to everybody. I'm just a man amongst men walking this path, trying to be sane when things are feeling insane. And then it just starts to feel a little more porous. Not when I'm in the grip of it and in pain, which there is that time too, where you're just like, Jesus. But it does seem like the recovery or the moving through, so that it doesn't have that same like completely flattened. And I don't know what that's about, but
I mean, if the underworld is the unconscious, like we have to go at these things alone. And it's not until we reemerge that we realize, like, oh, everybody's standing here on the other side waiting for me because they've had to do it too.
And that we're doing it. I mean, this is like, I don't know how I would say this, but people are going through it too. So let me go through it in a way where I'm not so taken down and filled with rage and wanting to set things on fire. Is there a way to be in the underworld, in the unconscious, come out, maybe still on fire, wanting to punch things or set something on fire, or weep out of grief? But maybe there's a third option. I don't know what that might be.
Something you said reminded me, Caitlin won't be surprised, reminded me of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Any opportunity to bring it up.
That and Oliver Twist.
One of Columbia's lines in the song is "Stay sane inside insanity." And the Rocky Horror Picture Show itself is a journey to the underworld, right? Like, as is Dorothy's journey down the yellow brick road to meet the Wizard of Oz. And she finds out all she needed was herself all along, right? We're always going on these journeys back to ourselves, trying to figure out how to stay sane inside insanity. And it's a universal experience. And so perhaps it's not
Why?
insanity. Perhaps
But
that's what
why?
brings us to insanity. We need to
Why
be
are
mixed up.
exactly? But why are human beings put on this earth? Like, what? Why is it that there is this kind of suffering and this mythopoesis of the underworld, and or the crucifixion, and or the Buddhist idea of suffering being a noble truth? Or like, why is that part of our little blue planet? It's just so cuckoo. It could have gone so many ways, but like the way it went was, we're here and we're really, no one gets out of the curriculum that has been given to them. And that curriculum is going to include working with pain and suffering and loss and crazy. I love Romanishan's view in The Wounded Researcher. He writes on the Orpheus and Eurydice myth about how Eurydice becomes like the soul is in the underworld. She dies, goes to the underworld, and she comes back on her terms, not on Orpheus's terms. And there's something about that I think is super helpful too, that we're not necessarily in charge. We have to trust that there is this good path with the soul. But
have you seen Hadestown, the
yes.
show? Caitlin,
I know.
you got to join the cult, dude.
I've been trying.
What I find interesting about in Hadestown, they are specifically addressed. I don't know how long it's been since you've seen it, but part of the narrative is that when Eurydice strikes the deal with Hades and goes into the underground, goes into the, I know you're laughing at me, but that's what they call it in the show. Way down under the ground. When she descends into the underworld, she sees that everybody around her has forgotten who they are. And as she goes around trying to introduce herself to people, she's horrified that they don't know their names and they don't even care to look at her in the eye. And part of her realization of being down there is realizing that she's going to have to forget. And she eventually starts forgetting until Orpheus shows up and reminds her who he is and who she is. And the metaphor of that, of being so focused on the task at hand that you forget who you are in the bigger picture of things, was really powerful for me, and to see it play out in that way. And in Chaos, we don't see Eurydice or any of the characters in the underworld having any sort of forgetting at all. They're the complete same characters that they were before they descended. Have you seen Chaos?
I haven't. Caitlin's been telling me about it, the Jeff Goldblum piece. And then I heard it wasn't picked up, right? It was not picked up.
It's not renewed for a second season, which is
tragedy.
Yeah. You guys loved it.
I love Jeff Goldblum and I love Greek mythology, so it was hard not to love for me. But can you tell us about your love of Persephone in that story?
I mean, what I wrote about in the dissertation was more about Demeter's experience of becoming a goddess to becoming human, funnily enough. Like, she had to go through, she literally disguises herself as an ordinary human being, as a peasant, when the loss of her daughter, and then almost becomes a mystic to the people, because in Eleusis, where they have these pilgrimages every year, people from Athens would make the 12-mile walk, and then no one knew what the Eleusinian mystery is. We think it's maybe about death and some kind of way of, death once dead, there's no more dying then, as Shakespeare said. My goodness, there's just been so much written. Like, Chris Downing has that lovely collection, The Long Journey Home. The Long Journey Home. One idea is that Persephone and Demeter are actually part of a whole female picture, so that the divine feminine consciousness couldn't survive in this patriarchal emerging, even with all the Greek goddesses, nonetheless, it was male dominated, and she got just put into the underworld where she just wasn't welcome. And then what's beautiful about that myth is they both, for the 6 months of the year in the seasonal version, she does come back. But it's super interesting when people think about the Persephone myth. I think most people think of the Demeter Persephone myth, but they don't remember, or consider that she was the goddess of the underworld. And that's like huge idea, that this daughter of the earth, the goddess of the grain, was the goddess of the underworld, and, you know, received people down there, and received, I mean, I don't know just how much she must have seen by being down there, what she meant, what she witnessed, the horrors and the death and the loss. And yeah. And I know that now, Caitlin, I think we've talked about it. They have trigger warnings, like if you're going to read Metamorphoses or the Homeric hymn in classical studies. But to Chris Downing's point, I think they're beautiful metaphors or literary pieces. There's so many ways to hold these stories in our psyche. If we were in a dance studio or a yoga studio and people had their yoga mats and were with their really comfy pillow and everyone could just lay down on their mat, I was just gonna hold a little meditative thing on Persephone in the underworld. I probably would have you do a body scan and completely relaxing the body and softening the breath, and then moving towards either in the woods or in the ocean and going down, and then allowing whatever image was there to come through. And why I'm mentioning this is that is Persephone at work. So that idea of when you're either writing your dream down or even just doing an interior practice and allowing those images to come through, you know, that is her in the room with you. I want to just shift for 1 second from a Buddhist view about the underworld, because how can we not, just for 1 second? And that is this. So it's so beautiful in this Greek or in these mythopoesis or Alice in Wonderland literary views of the underworld. I love that. And certainly the Jungian Hillman way, psychologically using these fairy tales or myths to kind of see through. But like in the Buddhist view, really the idea is, and then Caitlin, it'd be cool to talk about it from a Christian view. Part of the Dharma path is to become intimate with same old shitty self. So it's like I'm going through and I just keep fucking hell again, you know, like what I was saying earlier, or here's that crazy anxiety. Oh my God, here's my feeling of betrayal, or here's this crazy anger, or, you know, whatever my particular propensity is. And then from the Buddhist view, it's like, can I become intimate with this part of myself, really making it an inside job and almost working with it? Anything becomes workable in order to free the people out in the world that we keep locking, entangling with. So we're working with these parts of our psyche in a kind of diffusing it on the breath, becoming close to the part of ourselves that we think no one could ever get close to, and just, you know, like it becomes an inside job. And when there's Shempa, which is like that feeling of distraught, fraught, rage, grief, anguish, we start to cultivate this idea that it keeps moving. It never stays solid. And that's an underworld enlightenment, which is thinking it's always going to be like this, versus I take a seat right in the middle of my rage or my despair, and I don't move away from it, and I offer it tea or whatever, and I note that it's a little more porous than what I might think when I'm talking about it to my girlfriend or to my therapist. Or what do you think, Caitlin, from the Christian view? Is there a version of this, like underworld in terms of Christian mythology?
Brace yourself, Helen. I've been
Here
down.
it goes. Saddle up.
I've been hyper fixated all morning.
Hell yes.
So I get really upset about the idea of hell. Actually, I'll go back really far as I do, because my specific flavor of ADHD doesn't let me tell a whole story without going all the way back to the beginning.
Word.
So
I'm not familiar. Tell me more.
Shock.
So I grew up with ideas of hell that I think are pretty traditional ideas of hell, like fire and brimstone, Jonathan Edwards, you know, eternal torment kind of ideas. which that was like one of the things that started deconstruction for me. I had a professor in undergrad who she identified as a Buddhist Christian, and she did not believe in hell. She has a bunch of work published on how hell doesn't exist in the sense that Protestants often portray it in. To this day, I still reference her books all the time. I love this woman. She was incredible. But I started to, it's a question that I had as a child. Like, if God is love, then where and how does hell exist, right? If God is omnipresent, if God is omniscient, then where is hell? And if God is love, then why does hell exist? And that, like, it just didn't compute in my brain. The distinctions between all those things made zero sense to me. And I grew up in a part of the church that believes that the Bible is the literal word of God. And so things like books like Jonah are not parable. It is actually historical, or Genesis was actually historical. And Revelation is an actual prediction of what is going to happen in an actual end of time scenario.
Right.
And so there's a part of Revelation that talks about Hades being thrown into the pit of fire. And theologically, I remember hearing a number of people express confusion over this phrase because it doesn't like make sense, because most of the time in the New Testament, the references to the underworld are all translated as hell, which is not a biblical word. The word hell is not in the actual older versions, the Greek versions, the Hebrew versions of biblical translations. The word in Hebrew is Sheol, which is, you probably know more about it than I would, but the words in the New Testament that are used are Gehenna, and Gehenna is specifically used by Jesus when he's talking about, in Matthew, for example, he's talking about it's better to remove your appendages than sin. And the equation he makes to sinning, instead of removing your hands and your eyes and all those things, is being thrown into the pit of Gehenna. Historically, Gehenna is actually a trash pit outside of the city of Jerusalem. So it's like a geographical place outside of the East Old Wall where they would put filth and dead animals and corpses, and it was constantly ablaze because they were trying to get rid of all the refuse that came from the city of Jerusalem. And so, like, obviously Jesus is referencing sinning is the equivocal of living in somewhere like Gehenna, that torture, that loneliness that comes from living somewhere really filthy. Like, it is better to cut off your own hand instead of sinning and putting yourself in this position. Please, Randall.
Can I ask, do you think it's about like being in the literal trash pit? Like it's better to cut off your arm than being in a trash pit, or it's better to cut off your arm than be ostracized and cast out of the city walls and outside of society, right? Because you said this trash pit's outside the walls. So could this be like a Cain and Abel type situation?
That's how I would interpret it, as like, because in my perspective, and Randall and I have talked about this a bunch, isolation and being cut off from community, that is how I would define hell. You know, people commit suicide when they're in solitary confinement in jails, and being refused participation in community, that is hell. To me, whether or not Jesus is referring to eternity or not, the idea that being ostracized and isolated outside of the community of the city, in a place where things go to die, where bones are burned, where flesh is rotting, that is hell. Not necessarily the grossness of it, sure, is terrible. I have been to places like that in the Philippines. I've stood on the top of trash mountains that are burning and rotting, and it is terrible. Awful. It is a terrible place for kids to live and try and scrounge to make money, right? Like, it is not, ooh, it'll make me cry thinking about it, but like, it's awful. So I would interpret that as, to me, there's a very specific reason why Jesus didn't use the Aramaic equivalent of Sheol or Hades, because they were two very different things. Because Jesus does use the word Hades. And when Jesus uses the word Hades, or when the New Testament uses the word Hades, I, as a biblical scholar, will make the assumption that that is influenced by the Greco-Roman pantheon, right? Because Jesus
It must be.
Right. Jesus was alive only a couple years after, or during when Ovid's Metamorphoses was written, right? He was at the height of
The
right.
Roman Empire was alive and well. Give unto
Exactly.
Caesar. They had all the Roman gods
Mhm.
still
He
with
was
Caesar.
crucified by the Roman Empire, right? So like
Yeah.
he's walking around at the same time all these other gods are not walking around, if you will, like or walking around, however you want to see it. They're both at a height of power during this time, to put it in a specific context. So he references Hades, and it's likely that when he references Hades, he's referencing an idea that's closer to the Hades or the abode of the dead that we're discussing in terms of Greek
That's
mythology, or Sheol, which is just another, it is what it is kind of place, right? It's like the meadows of Asphodel. It just is where you go when you die. It's not positive, it's not negative. It's kind of a neutral leaning, not a happy place, but it is what it is the only way I can think to describe it. And the word for Hades used in the Bible is the same Greek word that Homer uses as the actual proper name of the god of the dead. And it's equivocal to the word for Pluto that Ovid uses to describe Hades in the Metamorphoses. It wasn't until like Augustine, so way later in history, that the idea of hell as we understand it now became conflated, or at least became aggressive in the sense of it became like an actual understanding of the underworld as this fiery place. And it wasn't until way later history that hell became, or until it got translated, those words in the Bible, Sheol, Hades, Gehenna, got translated as hell, as an eternal place of torment. In my opinion, it's very like, translation of the Bible is always political. I mean, if you look at it in context historically, someone is always translating some, like even the NIV or like certain translations of the Bible that I have on my shelf are specifically translated to not have inclusive language, or they specifically choose translation words in the New Testament where Paul is supposedly condemning homosexuality. There's a long history of biblical contention about why that word doesn't even mean, it doesn't mean what you think it means, right? Like it doesn't actually mean homosexual. It's a really complicated Greek word that really has no other references anywhere else. So we can't say this literally means homosexuals, that mankind shouldn't lie with mankind is not what the Greek means at all. There was a reason that became translated the way that it did. So because of all of this, I tend to think that Jesus is referencing two completely different things when he's talking about Gehenna and when he's talking about Hades, and neither of them are actually representative of what hell is considered in the Protestant church today.
Interesting.
So I remember people being confused about Hades being thrown into the pit of fire, Hades being thrown into Gehenna. In my opinion, as a biblical scholar, as a mythological scholar, as a Greco-Roman scholar, the Book of Revelation is a polemic or a piece of rhetoric specifically written to be against an old paradigm. So in my opinion, the biblical writer is expressly writing what he is to be a piece of literature against the Roman Empire, to propose a new paradigm that is different than the one that has been, and in his opinion, no longer should be. In my opinion, that's why you're having Hades thrown into the pit of fire, right? You're burning the old and trying to bring in the new, which is Jesus. In my opinion, a lot of the Bible is expressly written against the Greco-Roman deities to prove that Jesus is the superior God. The God of the Old Testament is superior to the Sumerian and Babylonian and Greco-Roman gods of creation because there wasn't bloodshed, there wasn't drops of blood that resulted in the birth of other deities, or there wasn't like a bunch of fucked up trial and error parts of humanity that gods were fighting over, right? Like this God existed and created from nothing this beautiful world that was good. And it talks specifically about God creating the sun and the moon. Well, those are almost every mythology, almost every religion sees them as some sort of deity, right? You have Helios in the Greco-Roman pantheon. That's just me. But I think the perspective of the underworld in Christianity is really interesting. it's the conflation of an ordinary place with ideas of eternity and Paradise Lost and Dante's Inferno. Like, that's where we start. Zoroastrianism also had some pretty aggressive ideas about demons and all those things. And even when Jesus is talking about Gehenna and Hades, he's not talking about demons living there or Satan or like all these horrible,
It's interesting.
Well, in the verse that Caitlin's referring to, Revelation 20, 11 through
Something.
15, I'd say. Verse 13, it says, the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. And so to me, this feels like all of the souls that were lost to the sea and sent to the Greco-Roman afterlife were brought up and judged against these new Christian ideals, and then sorted based on that.
Interesting.
And then the old ways were thrown out. And now like we're moving forward into this new era.
Randall specifically said the word Hades made her think of the actual god Hades being thrown into, burned up, and gotten rid of, which I thought was really...
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, I think it's like so cool to chew on this because it feels like the underworld is alive and well if you're going to lift it up and just take a peek under the hood, whether it's as the unconscious, whether it's from a scholarly view or mythopoetic view. And I just think it's so cool what you guys are doing, like really, really cool. And so fun for me to get the kind of more current, like even just using Gothic, that term, and Rocky Horror, although that's from the 70s or, you know, whenever it was, or Saw, the movie Saw, or that kind of, or Chaos with Jeff, because I kind of don't have that reference world. Mine just goes differently. So I'm always so delighted to be like, yeah, man, it's here too. Cool.
Yeah,
That's
heck
really
yeah.
cool. So
I love it too. I love your perspective on like Buddhism and Selkies and all that. Randall's perspectives on like current mythologies is always really informative and confronting
yes.
to me, because
Confrontation.
in my
the
brain,
underworld?
Randall is, I call her my underworld queen because she is. But I automatically think like, I literally can't not think of Christianity every time I hear these things. So in my mind, I feel like I go backwards in history to reference things, and Randall goes forwards, and it makes it quite the team.
Yeah, it's
I credit
great
a
what
lot
you
of
guys
that.
are doing. It's so cool. What did you say,
Thank
Randall?
you.
Sorry.
I was just gonna say I credit a lot of it because the last 10 years I've been a community college professor.
Oh,
and
yeah.
so like I have to
Bring them
stay up
into
to date
the
with the
yes.
relevant sources. And that's what started this whole project. Is I wanted to give my students something interesting and current, and Chaos had just come out. So I
It's
watched
so
an episode
cool.
of it and created an assignment series.
You are so cool.
Thanks, man. I love
it. Well, thank you guys so much for having
thank you
me.
for
What
being
a joy. And
Thank-
anytime you want to just chit chat, it's just so fun to like do the deep
This is
dive
fun.
and like
I loved this. I love your
yeah.
perspectives. I can't wait to listen to them over and over again,
Oh,
because
no.
I will.
no, don't.
Thank you for sharing,
this.
Helen.
All right, guys.
Perfect.
It was
Awesome.
lovely chatting
Thank
with you,
so
Helen.
much.
Thank you
We
so
will
much,
catch-
Helen.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye.
Love you,
Take
bye.
care. Love you.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us, everybody, on this episode of The Mything Link.
I'm Randall,
I'm Caitlin.
and we will see you next week. Goodbye. Thanks for listening to The Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall Oliate and Caitlin Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlin Curry. With music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernweh Collective Incorporated, a humanities nonprofit based in San Diego, California. As a small nonprofit, we appreciate if you have the time to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow our audience. For more information on our organization, head over to fernwehcollective.org. Thanks for listening.
I'm itching my boobs.
Scratching them. They
Scratching
itch.
them.
I don't know why that's one of my pet peeves.